Turkey has become a dictatorship.
Where President Recep Tayyip Erdogan won Sunday's presidential runoff. He extends his 20-year rule for a further 5 years, by far the longest rule of any leader since the founding of the Republic of Turkey.
Living in the Balkans, I meet a lot of people from Turkey. They are a very diverse group, to say the least. But if there's one thing that usually unites them, it is their wish to leave Turkey. They're tired of the failing economy. They're tired of the war in Syria. And most of all, they are tired of fighting amongst themselves and the extreme political polarization. They tell me that when they are outside of Turkey and see other Turkish people, they avoid them. I have also learned that it wasn't always like this. Turkey used to be on path towards European integration. It used to be a country that embraced modern sensibilities and shunned religious fundamentalism. This future of a modern and prosperous Turkey has never seemed further away than now, especially after Turkey waged a proxy conflict with the United States and possibly supplied one of the most radical terrorist organizations with weapons. So to start, how and why did Turkey make its historical pivot towards democracy? And what exactly is secularism? The transition from the Ottoman Empire to the Turkish Republic represents one of the most significant shifts in the political and cultural landscape of the modern Middle East. Central to this transformation was Mustafa Kemal Atatürk, whose reforms laid the foundation for a secular democratic nation-state. The decline of the Ottoman Empire was a prolonged process influenced by internal strife, military defeats, and the pressure of European imperialism. By the 19th century, the empire was referred to as the sick man of Europe, struggling with financial debt, administrative inefficiency. The empire's involvement in World War I on the side of the Central Powers culminated in its defeat and the subsequent partitioning under the Treaty of Sèvres in 1920. This treaty, perceived by Turks as a death sentence for their sovereignty, ignited the Turkish War of Independence, primarily between Turkish nationalists who wanted independence and self-governance for Turkey, and a combination of allied forces, including Britain and France. The result of this conflict was monumental, as the empire's monarchy, ruled by a sultan, and its religious leadership, known as the Caliphate, were abolished, ending centuries of Ottoman rule. In their place, the Republic of Turkey was established. For the first time, sovereignty resided with the nation and its people. This change set the stage for a period of intense reform, driven by a strong sense of nationalism and a desire for revolutionary change. Mustafa Kemal, later honored with the surname Atatürk, meaning father of the Turks, was elected as the Republic's first president. His vision for Turkey was a radical departure from the Ottoman past, aiming to transform the country into a modern, secular, and democratic nation-state. Perhaps the most enduring of Atatürk's reforms was the establishment of secularism as a principle of the Turkish constitution. Secularism was meant to ensure the separation of state and religion, guaranteeing religious freedom while preventing the influence of religion in government affairs. Today, anything that does not have an explicit reference to religion, either negatively or positively, may be considered secular. Secularity is best understood not as being anti-religious, but as being religiously neutral. But unlike the mainstream interpretation of secularism, Turkish secularism was more strict and emphasized freedom from religion in public spaces. A visible manifestation of this policy was the ban on religious headscarves in government buildings and educational institutions. While intended to ensure the secular character of the state, this policy has been criticized for infringing on individual rights, particularly those of Muslim women who choose to wear the veil as part of their religious identity. This principle was a defining characteristic of the Turkish Republic, distinguishing it from many of its Middle Eastern neighbors. Atatürk also introduced the Swiss Civil Code, replacing Islamic law. The Arabic script was replaced with the Latin alphabet, opening up Turkish society to Western influences. Atatürk even promoted Western dress codes, banning traditional Ottoman fez and encouraging the adoption of suits and hats, symbolizing modernity and progress. Religious schools were either closed or transformed into secular institutions. Education became a tool for instilling the principles of secularism and nationalism. Turkey transitioned to democracy in 1950 when it first held free and fair elections. But democracy was often stalled by military interventions and a politically motivated juristocracy. The military and judiciary have played crucial roles in upholding the secular principles established by Ataturk, intervening in politics through coups to protect these ideals.
The first coup occurred in 1960 after the ruling party loosened some of Ataturk's secular rules. In 1971, tensions across the political spectrum and an economic downturn led military general Memduh Tamash to give the then prime minister an ultimatum to form a new government. The 1970s were a turbulent time for Turkey. The country changed prime ministers 11 times, the economy was faltering, and violence between left-wing and right-wing groups continued. At the end of the decade, the military took matters into its hands. The 1997 coup has been famously labeled a postmodern coup. Some army officials were concerned about the increasing presence of political Islam in the country.
Even though Turkey never quite reached the heights of what the EU would determine as a fully functioning democracy, it did make major steps in the right direction. But it was more of a military democracy, with its generals in full control of who would take the reins of the country. For this reason, it was still a long way from joining the EU in the early 2000s. And it was also for this all-encompassing power of the military which determined Erdogan's strategy as he would enter office as prime minister shortly thereafter in 2003. Born on February 26, 1954 in Istanbul, Recep Tayyip Erdogan grew up in a working-class neighborhood. Erdogan's political career began with his involvement in the National Turkish Student Union, an association with an Islamic orientation. Erdogan was a member of several Islamist parties which were often subject to bans and political pressure in secular Turkey. In 1994, Erdogan was elected mayor of Istanbul, a position that provided him a platform to showcase his governance style. His tenure was marked by efforts to address the city's chronic issues such as water shortage, pollution, and traffic chaos. Erdogan's administration implemented practical solutions and infrastructure projects, which significantly improved the quality of life in Istanbul. However, his term was cut short when he was imprisoned in 1999 for inciting religious hatred by reciting a poem. The mosques are our barracks. The domes are helmets, the minarets are bayonets, and the faithful are soldiers, while Erdogan's supporters interrupted his speech with chants of "God is great." To the quasi-military court, Erdogan's speech sounded like a call for a holy war against the secular foundations of the republic. As a result, he was sentenced to 10 months in prison for inciting religious hatred, of which he served 4. Interestingly, the day Erdogan went to prison, he released an album called This Song Doesn't End Here. The album features a tracklist of 7 poems and became the best-selling album in Turkey in 1999, selling over 1 million copies. The upcoming imprisonment paradoxically increased his popularity, positioning him as a martyr for the cause of political Islam and free speech. His political career took a significant turn in 2001 with the formation of the Justice and Development Party, AKP. The AKP was established as a conservative democratic party, distancing itself from the overtly Islamist stance of its predecessors. This rebranding allowed the AKP to appeal to a broader segment of society, including conservative Muslims, liberals, and segments of the working and middle classes. In the 2002 general elections, the AKP won a landslide victory, and Erdogan became prime minister in 2003. His initial years in office were characterized by significant political and economic reforms aimed at securing Turkey's bid to join the European Union. These reforms, along with a period of unprecedented economic growth, solidified his and the AKP's popularity, and were also a part of a plan to disarm the military government. At the start of his political career as prime minister, Erdogan's main rival was the previously discussed military establishment, which was always vigilant about removing any threats to Turkey's secularist government. So from the start, Erdogan needed to be very careful about not rocking the boat too much, else he would lose his office to another coup orchestrated by the military. So Erdogan and AKP took advantage of the increasing public support for joining the EU, a key part of their strategy to stay in power. In doing so, the AKP became the new champions of the idea of Turkey becoming more integrated with Europe, a goal that aligned with Ataturk's vision. This strategy would keep the military government at bay and give Erdogan enough time to make some critical changes. And so Erdogan initiated a series of legal reforms aimed at curtailing the military's power. These reforms were often framed as efforts to align Turkish laws with European Union standards, particularly focusing on human rights and the rule of law. By doing so, Erdogan was able to reduce the military's autonomy and bring it under civilian control. Erdogan's government also pursued legal action against several high-ranking military officers through the Ergenekon and Sledgehammer cases. These trials, which were heavily criticized for their lack of due process and evidence, resulted in the imprisonment of numerous officers accused of plotting against the government. This weakened the military's power and its ability to challenge Erdogan's authority. Erdogan also made significant changes to the structure and appointment process within the military. This included increasing civilian oversight over military appointments and promotions, thereby ensuring that individuals loyal to Erdogan were placed in key positions. Altogether, these were the most radical reforms on the military status in the history of the Turkish Republic. The AKP also introduced reforms aimed at restructuring the judiciary. These changes expanded the powers of the president and the executive branch over judicial appointments, allowing Erdogan to place his loyalists in critical positions within the judiciary. This effectively sidelined secularist elements that traditionally held sway in the judicial system. Already by 2005, Erdogan had a firmer grasp over Turkey as a whole, and the chances of a coup were beginning to diminish significantly. And with that, Turkey's commitment to EU membership started to waver. Secularist critics of Erdogan saw that he was using the EU as a tool to weaken the Kemalist establishment as set out by Ataturk. By the time Erdogan was delivering his victory speech after his party won a third term in June 2011, he was alluding to his aspirations to be the voice of Muslims across the world. Sounding more confident and defiant, his speech was imbued with Islamic themes and mentions of Ottoman glory. It was the opening of a new chapter in Erdogan's plan, as he began to shift how people thought about Turkey. He started promoting the idea that Turkey is primarily a Sunni Muslim country and plays a key role in the global Muslim community known as the Ummah. By aligning Turkey more closely with Sunni Islam, Erdogan aimed to build a solid base of support amongst the country's majority Sunni population. This support was crucial for his political agenda and future plans. This identity shift also aimed to position Turkey as a leader in the Muslim world, potentially expanding its influence in the Middle Eastern politics and beyond. Most importantly, this redefinition of national identity was tied to Erdogan's ultimate goal, replacing Turkey's parliamentary system with an executive presidency. By appealing to religious and nationalistic sentiments, he hoped to rally enough support to change the constitution and increase the president's powers. Erdogan wanted to change the way Turkey's government and society worked, moving away from the ideas set by Ataturk to a system that would support his goal of creating a powerful presidential role for himself. The push for joining the European Union had achieved what it was meant to do: trick everyone into believing Erdogan was not a threat to the secularist Kemalist government. But by now, it was too late. By 2013, Erdogan argued that under his watch, Turkey had finally become a Muslim nation, freed from the harmful effects of many years of westernization. Indeed, the accumulation of changes in Turkey were beginning to be noticeable. In the political arena, Islamic values became more prominent, with policies and political messages often reflecting religious undertones. And there was a strategic placement of individuals from religious orders and communities into key positions within the government's bureaucracy. Cultural practices and national celebrations began to incorporate more Islamic elements. Changes were also made in the education system to include more religious content, increasing the number of hours dedicated to religious education, with courses on the Quran, and even banning the teaching of evolution from the curriculum. The number of Imam Khatib schools, which were originally established to train Islamic clerics, has also significantly increased. It's crucial to understand that Erdogan's strategy wasn't about turning Turkey into a theocracy, where religious law overtakes governmental law. Instead, his goal was to mold Turkish society and its governance structure in a way that Islamic values become deeply ingrained, supporting his vision of a strong, centralized executive presidency. By doing so, he hoped to secure the consent and support of a significant portion of the population, leveraging religious affinity to strengthen his political position, aiming to blend religious influence with political power to reshape the country's identity and governance. Erdogan told young people in Turkey to stop looking up to Western countries for ideas about freedom and rights. Instead, he said they should find inspiration in Turkey's own history. By doing this, Erdogan believed Turkey could become a leader for other Muslim countries and rise as a major player on the world stage. In Erdogan's view, democracy was mainly about voting, so he didn't give much importance to other parts of the democratic system, like the parliament or the courts, which are supposed to work independently to check the leader's power. And of course he didn't. All of those systems, by design, would limit his own authority in a future presidential role. He likened himself to Sultan Abdülhamit II, who between 1876 and 1909 ruled as an absolute monarch in the last decades of the Ottoman Empire. Given the great diversity of ethnicities in the Ottoman Empire, Abdülhamit believed that Islam was the only way to unite his people. Similarly, Erdogan was on a mission to protect Islam from attacks coming from Western countries and to bring Turkey back to a leading role in the Muslim world. He wanted people to see him as a modern defender of Islam, and general turmoil in the Middle East would help him do just that. The Arab Spring was a series of anti-government protests, uprisings, and armed rebellions that spread across much of the Arab world in the early 2010s. It started in Tunisia when a street vendor set himself on fire in protest against police corruption and ill treatment. This act of desperation sparked a wave of protests in Tunisia, leading to the ousting of its longtime president in January 2011. The success of the protests in Tunisia inspired similar movements in other countries like Egypt, Libya, Syria, Yemen, Bahrain, with citizens demanding political reform, greater freedom, more significant participation in governments, and an end to corruption and unemployment. The outcomes of these uprisings varied. Egypt saw the end of Hosni Mubarak's nearly 30-year rule. Libya resulted in a civil war that ultimately led to the downfall of Muammar Gaddafi. Yemen led to the resignation of President Ali Abdullah Saleh, though the country has since been embroiled in ongoing conflict. Syria descended into a brutal civil war that continues to this day. Tunisia is often cited as the most successful outcome, with a relatively peaceful transition to a democratic government. The timing of the Arab uprisings was opportune for Erdogan because it demonstrated to the region and the world that Islamist parties could come to power through popular movements. It also created a sense of momentum for political Islam, which Erdogan was promoting in Turkey at the time. Erdogan's plan involved leveraging this momentum to enhance Turkey's influence in the region and to reinforce his leadership by aligning Turkey with the broader movement towards Islamism that the Arab uprisings seemed to symbolize. Erdogan's response to the Arab uprisings, coupled with Turkey's example of combining democratic governance with Islamic values and achieving economic prosperity, positioned both Erdogan and the Turkish model at the heart of discussions about the future of the region. The appeal of this model lay in its promise of a political system that could honor cultural and religious values while embracing democratic principles and fostering economic growth. But in trying to become the leader of this new Middle East, Erdogan would bite off more than he could chew, especially in Syria. In March 2011, popular discontent with the rule of Bashar al-Assad had triggered large-scale protests and pro-democracy rallies across Syria as part of the wider Arab Spring protests in the region. After months of crackdown by government security apparatus, various armed rebel groups such as the Free Syrian Army began forming across the country, marking the beginning of the Syrian insurgency. By mid-2012, the crisis had escalated into a full-blown war. For Erdogan, this became another opportunity to bolster his image. When the conflict in Syria began, it quickly took on a sectarian dimension, with the majority Sunni population opposing the Alawite-dominated Assad regime, which is an offshoot of Shia Islam. So the conflict exacerbated regional Sunni-Shia tensions. By actively opposing Assad and supporting certain factions of the Syrian opposition, many of which were Sunni, Erdogan positioned himself as a champion of Sunni Muslims. At home in Turkey, this stance allowed him to frame his secular critics as being out of touch with the broader Muslim community's sentiments. By casting the struggle in Syria as one with religious undertones, he could paint the secular opposition in Turkey as unsympathetic to the plight of Sunni Muslims, thereby undermining their legitimacy and making himself more appealing to the religious population of Turkey. However, the decision to militarily support the opposition early in the conflict became one of the key developments that pushed Syria into a full-blown civil war, ultimately unleashing a humanitarian disaster which is still ongoing. Turkey collaborated closely with Saudi Arabia and Qatar, both of which provided financial backing for the operation. This financial support was crucial in purchasing weapons and supplies for the opposition forces. Turkey's geographic proximity to Syria made it an ideal route for supplying the Syrian opposition. The Hatay province turned into a crucial center of military operations, especially with the establishment of military camps within its borders, a sanctuary for defecting Syrian military officers who were allowed to cross the border with ease. Hatay's cities and its hospitals ended up providing medical treatment to wounded rebels. The medical staff at these hospitals were instructed not to request identification cards or ask any questions of the wounded individuals they treated. Despite Turkey's best efforts to supply the opposition, Assad would not be easily toppled, and Turkey would have to commit more and more resources to fight, and thereby destroy its international reputation in the process. Erdogan's goal of being the savior of Islam would start to sink him, and soon he would be pushed to change his objective, especially as trouble started brewing at home. On 28th of May 2013, started a small environmentalist movement to save Gezi Park, one of Istanbul's last green spaces in its European half. The government wanted to turn it into a mixed-use development with a shopping mall and a reconstruction of the Ottoman-era Taksim military barracks. The government's response to these peaceful protests sparked outrage across the country. The Gezi Park protests turned into a broader movement against what many perceived as the authoritarian tendencies of Erdogan's government. Issues such as restrictions on freedom of speech, the press, and judicial independence. As a result, 3.5 million people out of Turkey's population of 80 million are estimated to have taken an active part in almost 5,000 demonstrations across Turkey. 22 people were killed and more than 8,000 injured, many critically.
I think some people wonder whether Erdogan's rule is a sign that all of this is a sign that Turkey could lose some of the secular traditions that really it adopted post-Ataturk a century ago.
Yeah. Well, that's already happening.
Could it become another Islamic superstate?
Erdogan framed the protest as an attack on his historical mission to reshape Turkey to reflect its Ottoman and Islamic heritage. This narrative portrayed the protests as being orchestrated by internal and external colonizers, suggesting that Western influences and domestic traitors were undermining Turkey. As a result, Erdogan's base of support became more ideologically homogeneous, predominantly composed of religious conservatives. This shift made the base more receptive to Erdogan's messaging and goals, creating a more unified and polarized front. On 25th of June 2013, EU foreign ministers backed Germany's proposal to postpone further EU membership talks with Turkey. This delay raised new doubts about whether Turkey should ever be admitted to the European Union. And for Erdogan, the protests meant that it was time for a new strategy if he was to remain in control. Up until now, the Turkish presidency was largely a ceremonial role, but Erdogan sought to transform it into a position of autocratic power. In 2007, Turkey passed a constitutional amendment that changed the method of presidential election from a parliamentary vote to a direct public vote. This set the stage for Erdogan to run for president in 2014, the first presidential election in Turkey to be decided by popular vote. Erdogan and his party exerted considerable influence over the Turkish media. This control allowed them to shape public narratives and minimize the impact of negative coverage surrounding the Gezi protests. By portraying them in a negative light, they managed to maintain the support of their religious voter base. Erdogan successfully used a polarizing strategy, framing the protest as a challenge to Turkish values and sovereignty. He positioned himself and his government as defenders of Turkey against what he described as foreign influences and domestic unrest. This appeal to nationalism resonated with a significant portion of the population. Prior to the Gezi protests, Turkey experienced a period of significant economic growth and development. This success bolstered Erdogan's popularity, with many Turkish citizens attributing their improved living standards to his policies. Despite economic challenges that emerged later, the memory of these achievements helped maintain support. And at the time, the opposition parties in Turkey were fragmented and unable to present a unified and compelling alternative to Erdogan's leadership. This division made it difficult for the opposition to capitalize on the discontent expressed during the Gezi protests. Erdogan managed to win approximately 52% of the vote, assuming office in August 2014. Despite the presidency's limited powers, Erdogan remained highly influential, signaling a shift towards a more centralized form of governance. Gezi also made Erdogan realize that the Kurdish population would likely never support his executive presidency bid, and this was confirmed by the events simultaneously unfolding in Syria, forcing Erdogan further down the path of embracing Turkish nationalism and ultimately to ruin his relationship with his democratic partners and betray the Kurdish population. With an estimated population of 25 to 35 million, Kurds represent one of the largest ethnic groups in the Middle East, without a state of their own. After the collapse of the Ottoman Empire following World War I, the Treaty of Sèvres in 1920 proposed the creation of a Kurdish state. However, the subsequent Treaty of Lausanne in 1923 divided the Kurdish regions amongst the newly established countries of Turkey, Iraq, and Syria, leaving Kurds without a nation-state. As a result, according to CIA, Kurds form approximately 18% of the population in Turkey, but it could be as much as 25%, going by other estimates. As such, the Kurds make up the second largest ethnic bloc in Turkey, and they like to make themselves known, as the Kurdish Workers' Party, otherwise known as the PKK, is a militant organization which has waged an armed struggle against the Turkish state for cultural and political rights. They are labeled terrorists by the Turkish government. Traditionally, especially under the influence of Kemalism, Turkey was seen as ethnically homogeneous, aiming for a unified Turkish identity. This approach often marginalized ethnic minorities, especially Kurds. Contrary to this, Erdogan proposed a vision of the Turkish nation that is inclusive of its ethnic diversity, with Islam as the unifying factor. Erdogan early in his career highlighted the Kurdish community's deep religious faith, describing them as one of the most pious ethnic groups in Turkey. With this redefined national identity, Erdogan promoted a peaceful approach to resolving the Kurdish issue by emphasizing shared religious values over ethnic divisions. Erdogan often referred to Kurds as the grandchildren of Salahuddin Ayyubi, who was known in the West as Saladin, a Kurdish-origin Muslim leader and the first Sultan of Egypt and Syria. He is celebrated for recapturing Jerusalem from the Christian Crusaders in the 12th century. This comparison was meant to evoke pride amongst Kurds for their historical and religious lineage, highlighting their significant role in Islamic history. Diyarbakir, the largest Kurdish city in Turkey, holds cultural and historical importance. It houses the tombs belonging to the companions of the Prophet Muhammad, and Erdogan elevated its status by likening it to Mecca and Medina, which are the two holiest cities in Islam. And in an effort to reach out to the Kurdish population, Erdogan commissioned a translation of the Quran into Kurdish. And Erdogan made it a point to carry this Kurdish version of the Quran during his rallies. So as long as the Kurds gave their vote to Erdogan and supported his executive presidency, he supported them. But as a result of their success in Syria, the Kurds started to demand more. With the power vacuum created by the Syrian Civil War, especially in the regions bordering Turkey, the Syrian Kurds, primarily represented by the People's Protection Units, YPG, made significant gains. These areas rich in cultural and historical significance for the Kurds became the foundation for what they termed the Autonomous Administration of North and East Syria, also known as Rojava. The YPJ, along with its allies in the Syrian Democratic Forces, played a crucial role in the fight against ISIS, gaining international recognition and support, particularly from the United States, solidifying their control over large territories in Syria. They established a form of semi-autonomous governance based on democratic confederalism. For Erdogan, the moment of truth came during the 2014 Kobani protests, as the Kurds in Turkey protested against what they perceived to be insufficient support from the Turkish government for the Kurdish fighters in Kobani. It now seemed possible that the long-standing aspiration of Kurds for an independent state or greater autonomy might be achieved, especially as their fighters gained the backing of Western powers in the fight against ISIS. This expectation went in the face of what Erdogan was trying to achieve. Erdogan understood that the Kurdish population's support, which he had previously considered attainable, would not be forthcoming for his bid to transform the presidency into a more central and powerful role. The Kurds' discontent with his policies, especially in light of Kobani, made them unlikely allies. So Erdogan pivoted away. This realignment not only helped him secure the backing needed for the executive presidency, but also changed the tone and direction of his governance, with less emphasis on religious inclusivity and more national unity and ethnic Turkishness. Erdogan was no longer trying to be Abdul Hamid amidst growing tensions. Operation Euphrates Shield was a military campaign launched by Turkey on August 24, 2016. The operation was presented as a move to secure Turkey's borders and protect the country from ISIS attacks, which had been a growing concern. But another significant objective was to counter the Kurdish militia, which Turkey considered an extension of the PKK. So the operation was a part of Erdogan's firm new stance against Kurdish groups, both within Turkey and in neighboring countries, viewing them as a threat to Turkey's national security and his executive presidency.
A convoy of Turkish special forces and 1,500 Syrian rebels. The group claimed victory within a few hours, in the first phase of Turkey's first operation on the ground in Syria.
The Kurds and their goal of autonomy became Erdogan's main concern. By targeting the YPG, Turkey aimed to prevent the establishment of a continuous Kurdish-controlled corridor along its border with Syria. Such a corridor could potentially provide the PKK and related groups with a base of operations against Turkey. For Erdogan, this turned out to be the winning move. The tough stance on the Kurdish issues helped him consolidate nationalist support and eventually assume his presidential position in 2018. There was, however, another event which would shake up Turkey's democratic foundations to their very core, helping Erdogan further consolidate his power. On 15th of July 2016, a faction within the Turkish armed forces, organized as the Peace at Home Council, attempted a coup against state institutions, including the government and president. They attempted to seize control of several places in Ankara, Istanbul, Marmaris, and elsewhere, but failed to do so after other military forces and civilians loyal to the state defeated them. The council cited an erosion of secularism, elimination of democratic rule, disregard for human rights, and Turkey's loss of credibility in the international arena as key reasons for the coup. During the attempt, over 300 people were killed and more than 2,100 were injured. Many government buildings, including the Turkish parliament and the presidential palace, were bombed from the air. One thing is certain, Erdogan did not let this crisis go to waste. Using the state of emergency declared after the coup, the government launched a wide-ranging crackdown, initially targeting those suspected of being directly involved in the coup. But the crackdown quickly expanded, with purges of the military, judiciary, and civil service, ostensibly to remove elements hostile to Erdogan's rule. More than 77,000 people have been arrested, and over 160,000 were fired from their jobs due to their supposed association with the coup. The opposition criticized Erdogan's actions, arguing that his sweeping response to the failed coup was in itself a form of coup. They claimed that under the guise of responding to the coup attempt, Erdogan was actually eliminating dissent and consolidating power. 1 year later, in 2017, a referendum was held on changing Turkey's governance from a parliamentary to a presidential system. The proposal narrowly passed, marking a significant victory for Erdogan. The events following the 2016 coup attempt effectively led to the establishment of a new political regime in Turkey, centered around the presidency. The balance of power shifted significantly, with the president acquiring a central role in governance. And of course, in 2018, Erdogan was re-elected as president. For those critical of Erdogan, the coup attempt was a false flag operation staged by Erdogan himself to tighten his grip on power. A retired Turkish army general said of the botched coup, "If the Turkish army wants to bring down a government, it is perfectly capable of doing so." What we saw on July 15 were theatrics. There were calls for opposition parties and international observers for an independent investigation into the coup attempt. They wanted to know how the plotters managed to organize such an extensive operation and how the Turkey's intelligence services failed to detect it in advance. However, these demands were not permitted by Erdogan. For now, there seems to be no consensus on the matter. What is a lot more certain, however, is that Turkey's democracy suffered a terrible blow. We are violating every single principle Ataturk set forth for Turkey's Middle East policy. We first tried to topple the region in a neighboring country by arming radical Islamist groups. Then we changed our minds and decided to empower that very regime that we so desperately tried to overthrow. Then we invaded parts of that country and became occupiers of Arab lands. Along the way, we pissed off pretty much everyone. If Ataturk saw what we are doing in Syria, he would roll in his grave. In the early years of the Syrian Civil War, Turkey was a staunch supporter of the Syrian opposition. The Turkish government aimed to help overthrow Assad, believing a change in leadership would benefit Turkey's interests and contribute to regional stability. Turkey provided various forms of support to groups opposing Assad, including political backing, humanitarian aid, and military assistance. But as the conflict dragged on, Erdogan began to reassess his priorities, both at home and in Syria, especially with the emergence of Syrian Kurdish militia groups. And then, while capitalizing on the chaos and power vacuum created by the civil war, another player entered the arena, ISIS, which quickly gained control over significant portions of Syrian territory, including key cities and oil-rich regions. Its presence added a new dimension to the civil war. The group fought not only against the Syrian government forces, but also against other rebel groups, including Kurdish militias. This complexity made the conflict more intractable and hampered efforts to find a resolution. The rise of ISIS in Syria drew a strong international response, leading to the formation of an international coalition led by the United States to combat the group. This included airstrikes, support for local ground forces, and efforts to cut off the group's financial and logistical support networks. Initially, Turkey explored the possibility of cooperation with them to counterbalance both Assad's regime and the Kurdish militia. However, the US's decision to support the YPG in the fight against ISIS complicated these plans, leading to tensions between Turkey and the US. So Erdogan started seeking cooperation with Assad's regime and its key ally, Russia, a complete turnaround from his original strategy. In September 2014, ISIS fighters launched a major assault on Kobani. This town had been under the control of Kurdish forces affiliated with the PKK. The Kurdish fighters, despite being well organized, faced a brutal struggle against the better equipped ISIS forces. The battle was fierce, with intense street-to-street fighting that threatened to result in ISIS victory. The violence and fear of an ISIS takeover led to a humanitarian crisis, with thousands of Syrian Kurds fleeing Kobani. Many sought refuge by crossing the border into Turkey, adding to the already significant number of Syrian refugees. The battle caught the world's attention, partly due to its symbolic significance in the fight against ISIS. International media extensively covered the siege, and there were calls for greater support for the Kurdish fighters. Concerned about the possibility of an ISIS victory, President Barack Obama reached out to Erdogan and pleaded for Ankara's assistance. Erdogan was hesitant. Not receiving any cooperation from Turkey, President Obama authorized an airdrop of medical supplies and ammunition to the Kurdish forces, and the Kurdish forces were able to turn things around as they recaptured the whole of Kobani city in late January 2015. Almost all of the villages previously lost in the Kobani region by mid-March 2015. The siege was referred to by some as the Kurdish Stalingrad. The decision to directly support Kurdish fighters without Turkey's approval strained relationships between the US and Turkey. The relationship further soured when the US imposed sanctions on Turkey.
Are you concerned that Erdogan will try to wipe out the Kurds?
I will wipe out his economy if that happens.
The animosity wasn't one-sided. In Turkey, there was strong anti-American sentiment, fueled by the US actions and policies in the region. While in the US, Erdogan was criticized for potentially supplying ISIS during the years of trying to topple Assad, and his domestic crackdown on political opposition and freedom of speech, especially during the Gezi protests. One of the most immediate and noticeable effects was a sharp decline in the value of the Turkish lira. The sanctions, along with existing concerns about the health of the Turkish economy and the independence of its central bank, contributed to the lira losing around 40% of its value against the dollar in 2018, leading to soaring inflation rates as the cost of imported goods surged. All of this was arguably one of the main contributing factors to Turkey's currently ongoing economic debt spiral. At the time, all of this pushed Turkey further away from the West and eventually encouraged a closer relationship with Russia. In September 2015, Russia initiated military intervention in Syria to support the Assad regime, which was struggling, especially since at the time Turkey was arming its opposition. The tension between Turkey and Russia escalated dramatically in November 2015 when Turkey shot down a Russian military jet near the Syrian border, claiming it had violated Turkish airspace. This incident brought the two countries to the brink of military conflict, marking a low point in their relations. In retaliation, Russia also imposed a series of economic sanctions on Turkey, but they wouldn't last long, as Turkey and Russia began a gradual process of reconciliation and cooperation, recognizing the mutual benefits of partnership, particularly in the context of the Syrian conflict. They resumed their economic and energy collaborations, including significant projects like the Turk Stream natural gas pipeline. Along with Iran, they initiated the Astana talks, a series of negotiations aimed at reducing violence and finding a political solution to the Syrian conflict. It also further played into Erdogan's new nationalistic stance. Being friends with Russia looked good, especially considering the general public's disgust with the United States for supporting Kurdish terrorists in Syria. Erdogan did, however, have to keep silent about how the Russians also supported the Kurds.
Even top Kurdish commander Mazloum Kobani lamented that the sudden U.S. retreat left him no choice but to turn to the Russians. We had an understanding with Russia to avoid Turkish attacks in this region, he said. The vacuum Americans left behind, we had to fill with the Russians.
All this has culminated in Turkey's decision to purchase the S-400 missile defense system from Russia, a landmark event that reflected the country's growing closeness with Russia, raising questions about Turkey's strategic orientation within NATO. As a result of proceeding with the purchase, Turkey was eventually removed from the F-35 program, which would cost it an estimated $9 billion in revenue, and of course also play a part in further economic sanctions imposed by the United States.
Пароль veriyorsun.
За меня тоже заплатишь, да?
Да, заплачу, конечно. Так ты же гость.
Siz misafirsiniz, tabii ki vereyim. Teşekkür ederim.
Вот.
Вкусно.
So, where does this leave us? One of the most notable domestic implications of Erdogan's tenure has been the increased polarization of Turkish society. Political discourse has become increasingly divided along ideological lines, with supporters of Erdogan and the AKP pitted against secularists, liberals, and various minority groups who are not quite able to come together and create a unified front against Erdogan. Opposition parties in Turkey face significant challenges from navigating a highly polarized political landscape to dealing with legal and administrative hurdles that can impede their activities. The consolidation of power under the presidency and the crackdown on dissent have made it increasingly difficult for opposition voices to be heard and to effectively challenge the ruling party's policies. Under Erdogan's leadership, concerns have been raised regarding the rights of ethnic and religious minorities, especially the Kurds, who are now perceived as burdens to Turkish society as a whole. Turkey's aspirations to join the European Union have been a significant aspect of its international relations, especially in the early years of Erdogan's tenure. However, EU accession talks have stalled, primarily due to concerns over human rights, the rule of law, and democratic backsliding. The EU has repeatedly called on Turkey to address these issues, highlighting the importance of fundamental freedoms and judicial independence as key criteria for membership. But no reversal seems to be imminent, especially as Erdogan maintains control of Turkey by allying with the nationalists and anti-West Turkish sentiment. Strained relations with the United States, particularly over Turkey's acquisition of the S-400 missile defense system and the proxy conflict in Syria, has damaged Turkey's relationship with the West, pushing it to seek a more independent role in regional politics in ways that sometimes conflict with the interests of its NATO allies. All of this has made economic hardships in Turkey significantly worse, with the sanctions possibly pushing Turkey into an inflationary spiral. Astonishingly, despite the economic hardships and over 3 million Syrian refugees, allegations of corruption, no Kurdish vote, a badly managed natural disaster, Erdogan still managed to survive and remain in power with his incredible ability to tap into the cultural and nationalistic sentiments of the Turkish populace, leaving him in charge till 2028, at which point it will be a quarter of a century of progressively more authoritarian rule. From his skillful dismantling of the military government in the early 2000s to his push for a revival of an all-inclusive Sunni nation, then his U-turn embracing Turkish nationalism, betrayal of the Kurds, and an abandonment of his Western allies. Erdogan's legacy is one of a political chameleon. Everything he has ever done has been in the service of one singular goal, a Turkish dictatorship, not the prosperity of the Turkish people. Next, why not watch my video on Serbian neutrality and learn about the history that pushes Serbians to support Russia? And this is my Patreon map. Everyone on this map is a legend and supports this channel directly. Thank you all so very much. Geoperspective out.